to see things like this in his work. Collage images with the overlapping panels and colors and everything too, that perhaps borrowed from some of the Picture Post magazines and German Zeitung illustrated magazines of the 20s and 30s. The styles were used in incorporating these collages to make these images. So you see that it had a political aspect to it as well. One of the chief photographers in World War II was a name you might remember, Edward Steichen. Where have we seen that name before? The man who helped Stieglitz set up the photo secession. Steichen continued as a commercial photographer in the 20s and 30s. We'll show you more of his work as well. But during World War II, he was appointed head of the U.S. Naval Photographic Unit and trained photographers throughout the war. And this is an example of the type of work that they were doing aboard the ships in the Pacific and the Atlantic during World War II. Photographs also took a large mature step, albeit a gory one, because this was the first time that photographs were published showing American dead. In 1945, with the invasion of the Pacific Islands, these were actually published. This is the first image of that sort published in Life magazine at the time. You can see some of the lines in the pictures too are from the wire service printings that were done with it. Robert Capa went in with the assault on D-Day in the beaches of Normandy. This is one of the few surviving images he did from that particular spread. He actually went in with the troops, unarmed, photographed a number of images and sent the pictures back to the frigate ship where the press pool was located. He had a technician who developed the images. They were so excited about developing the images and everything that he left the dryer on too long, and all but 8 images melted off the emulsion of the print. So Capa's daring day of being shot at the beach results in 8 only images surviving from that particular take. Yeah.
Is that the reason for the lines that are cutting across images?
No, again, these lines are from wire service images, okay. The ones that were transmitted to the press. He was a little bit cleaner printer than that, definitely. But they did definitely suffer from that work. You see prints arrive through all aspects of government agencies too. This is one of the famous Russian images of Ev Kalday's photograph of Russian assault during the Battle of Leningrad. And another picture from the Russians of the taking of the Reichstag in Berlin in 1945 and the raising of the Soviet flag above the Reichstag. And the aftermath of covering the documentation of the prisoner of war camps and the concentration camps. And of course the individual tragic imagery of the battles too that occurred throughout the war. One of the most documented events turned out to be one of the most famous pictures of the time too. That of course the raising of the Stars and Stripes over Iwo Jima. You've seen a much probably romanticized version of that in the films that Clint Eastwood recently did. The actual story is worth repeating because it's a good story about the whole message of impact in imagery and how fortune plays a part in the creation of images. 6 days into the battle, when they captured Mount Suribachi on the island of Iwo Jima from the Japanese, the battle would go on for another month. They sent a group of men upstairs who raised a flag on Iwo Jima. This is that first flag. The commanders on the ships in the harbor looked up and said, "It's too small, we can't see it, it's not an inspiration for men," or else at number 2, depending on which story you hear, "I want that flag for our troops, so bring it down and put up another one." So they sent up a second team up the top of the hill with the flag. And going up the hill also was a filmmaker for the military, Bill Gnost, who happened to run in through an AP photographer, Joe Rosenthal, who said they're raising another flag up there, come on up. So they went on up the hill that day. It was no professionally staged photo op, as you might imagine. It was whatever the men had, with their cameras, heard about that day on the hill. Rosenthal got there. Rosenthal was not that tall a man, so he stacked a couple of rocks up, grabbed his camera, stood on them to get the picture of them raising the flag. At the time, he was picking up his camera, Gnaust, who was actually operating a motion picture film, there's actually color movie film of this, he said, Joe, hurry up, they're raising the flag. So Joe turned around, pulled the slide on his image. As the first flag came down, the second flag came up and snapped almost immediately, this image. He did not, of course, develop it that day. He was in the middle of a battle and the works on the island. But he did take a second picture that day from his same perch of the men who, after they had raised the flag. That is the second picture. He knew he took both shots, sent them down with the press pool to the ships where it was developed, and sent off to the agencies. He was then informed that he had gotten a great shot, and they really loved it, and it was going to be published on the pages of the newspapers of the world. And for the first 24 to 48 hours, Joe Rosenthal, who took the most famous picture of World War II, thought this was the picture they were talking about. In actuality, it became this one. Well, he had seen it simply as a blur going and up and being raised at the time. One day I'm going to figure out how to put the film strip on here so you can see it, because the thing goes up so quickly, it's really rather amazing how you grab just the right decisive moment in the shot to get that image, but he did. But beyond that, this image became a cultural landscape and marking stone for the rest of the war, and indeed afterwards, and has existed in many variations and themes throughout our cultural history since. The flag, by the way, did survive after the winds tore it up on the top of the mountain, but it still stands as a strong American icon to this day. As does this image taken by Alfred Eisenstadt in the streets of New York City on VJ Day when the war was over. A book has recently been published. A very devoted OCDC historian tracked down the man and woman in this picture, found out who they were, and wrote a very interesting picture of it, because the sailor and the nurse did not know each other. They simply, walking down the street, it was such a celebratory day, he grabbed the nurse, kissed her, and they went on their ways separately. But it came back with this wonderful collision of event, time, place, photographer, and individuals. And it makes a very fascinating story. That's sort of the way it is a lot with war photography, and indeed with any dramatic moment in passing, all the events coming together and making this work. And it all fused itself into what had been practiced at the time called photojournalism, and was now becoming a major discipline in our era in the time in the 40s and the 50s. Documentary photography existed, of course, but it was burgeoning out. There were surveys like the Farm Security Administration. There were societies like we'll see in a moment with the Photo League. There were the formation of press agencies that would take pictures and sell them to various members of the illustrated press, the most famous being Magnum. The illustrated press was dominating the media at the time. It would have a golden age starting in the 30s, certainly flourishing in the 40s and 50s, and continuing on until the rise of other media, such as television in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. It also reflected this rapid development in modern life. You wanted pictures much more instantaneously. You wanted them much more quickly. You wanted to not only get them, but get them out. Get them to be seen, and that continued to go. You know, it was not even a pace; it was a velocity. It was going so fast. And also, the work of the documentary photographer at this time was reflecting the cultural landscape that was arriving at this time. Dan has begun to show you a peek at that with the rise of the Cold War, the changes that were going on in the sciences and the reflection that was arising in the social era of the same time. All these things and the psychological impact of them began to be reflected in photojournalism. Take, for example, the Farm Security Administration, our old friends from the 30s. By the time the war was on, they had evolved into the Office of War Information Photography Division. And their challenge became entirely different. In the 30s, they were showing the struggle against the Depression and what was going on in this country. By the way, I interrupt to show you a moment because this is one of the many negatives from the Farm Security file, and the photographer who works for the the United States government printing these prints whenever you order a picture for the FSA. That's to give you an idea that all these, behind them, there's a real negative behind each one of these images. This was taken on the last day he was printing the last negative. They now all do them digitally. So, a bit of a sidelight for you as well. The Office of War Information, which is what the FSA evolved into, flourished from 1942 to 1945. It continued to employ photographers, a number of different ones, a number of growing body of them. And their job changed from this documentary propagation of the documentation of the Depression and America's rise from it. And it now depicted the theme, America at War. It tried to show what daily life was like in this country throughout the war to sort of reflect what the battlefield photographers were showing in Europe and in Asia. And so it began to just show the daily home life that occurred in America at the time. You can see, I think, a lot of the roots of the 30s in this work, too. We're still going for signage, we're still going for relationships with people, we're still trying to show a sort of optimistic tone. But that existed in the OWI at the end of World War II. Evolving also out of the war was the commercial production of the petroleum industry in its rise at the time. And one of the first major sponsored industrial projects using photography occurred between 1943 and 1950 through Standard Oil of New Jersey. Their theme, a drop of oil in everyone's life. And to how to show that in terms of culture and society. It might not come as a surprise to you to know that Stryker, who had left the FSA, was hired by them. And so you can kind of imagine what the work is going to look like. Stryker had the same well thought out guidelines of any social historian, any economic historian, any politically conscious historian. So the Standard Oil work also reflects the life. But always if we can work something petroleum related into the image, so much the better. At the same time, there are many distinguished and very fascinating images that evolve from the work. A trucker driving at night, for example. Let's not forget our socialists as well, however. We mentioned them earlier when we talked about it in the 30s, but this again bears importance to remind the Photo League, because they continued on until 1951 when they were disbanded. They had an attempt to show the documentary landscape as well, but from a different sort of perspective. An economic one, a socialist one, a very politically oriented one, to show what was going on among the impoverished classes and the lower classes in the culture and society. Yes, they numbered a number of socialists and communists, both intellectuals and activists in the community. But they wanted to, as they said in their quote, show honest photographers who photograph America. So you find many of these photographers having various works to do with the meetings of the Photo League. It was based entirely in New York City. And at any given weekly meeting of the Photo League, you might have work of such persons, James Van der Zee showing classes, or Elliot Ellis-Often showing pictures of life on the Lower East Side. But the next class might be about how to use flash to get the picture you wanted. So there was this combination of social and technological work that went on with the Photo League until its disbanding by the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1951. Probably the one who set the greatest pace for this work, and also probably the most apolitical member of the group, was a fellow named Arthur Fellig. His press name was Ouija. He took his name from the Ouija board, although he spelled his name W-E-E-G-E-E. And this is Arthur at work at his desk. He kept all his photographs, all his film stock, everything in the trunk of his car, set up a typewriter desk, and would simply listen to the police radio and beat most of the competition to the scene of whatever crime was there. Take out his cameras and his flash guns and shoot the pictures directly, violently, uncompromisingly, in a very strong pictorial way. Somebody shot down in the street, here's the gun, here's the victim, flash, bang, sell it to the press. he set up the whole model of the cigar-chomping, grimy photojournalist that you see coming out of the 40s and the 50s, and set the tone. What was interesting about Luigi was that he also turned around. Not only did he take the crime scene, but he'd turn around and take the picture of the people at the crime scene. And all the different flood of expressions, from curiosity to horror to humor, that occurred in the people who watched this too. He was really very unafraid of whatever he directed his camera at. Don't forget, this is New York City. Who is still running his gallery with pictorial work showing on the wall with photo-secessionist work? Anybody remember his name? Or is he so forgotten by 1945? Alfred Stieglitz again. Stieglitz still had his gallery going in 1946. And Luigi bumped into him one night, went back and photographed Stieglitz. Now is a very crabby, very dying old man. Stieglitz died in 1946. This is a very interesting image because this is the way the modern journalist of that era depicts the pictorialist who changed the whole tone of American art at the time. So an interesting transitory image as well. In America, there are very many directions that photography began to head. With the aftermath of the war, there was a certain cultural optimism, a certain attempt to look at the world in different ways. There was the rise of a whole industrial complex, a whole commercial area that went in this way, and all these elements came together. Some in the way of straight news photography, the classic picture of a triumphant Truman showing the Chicago newspaper getting it wrong about his election in 1948. The retirement of Babe Ruth in baseball and the whole rise of sports photography. This is Picasso's Guernica being installed at the Museum of Modern Art after World War II. The Korean War, which burst in 1950, and David Douglas Duncan's pictures of freezing soldiers in the battles. And perhaps most fascinating, the whole rise of the civil rights movement in the 1950s. Cotton farmers paying off their men, the beginning of the protest movement and the social rising of the era. The strikes, the work, the social protests, all came before the camera in the 1950s. They certainly exist in the way of tapes and film too, but I think some of the still images are the most powerful. And not just the tragedies, but also the triumphs of the era as well. You wanted the king, Dan, I gave you the king. Yes, because the whole rise of personality in the cultural era was bolstered and supported by photography too at this time also. The young Elvis and a few of his fans. And don't forget Life magazine at the time, which began in '36 with this issue. Certainly the heyday of it was the 40s and the 50s, the whole idea of a picture story. You opened a page of Life and you were confronted with something like this, these sort of blocky constructs of images with text, brief text with them too. A way to tell a story in a few short sentences plus many pictures. This was very typical of Life. And yet if you take the time to look at the pages of Life, you will see that almost each picture in there is a stunning picture in and of itself. This is Eugene Smith's portrait of a Spanish village in Spain after World War II, after this, of course, the Spanish Civil War, with the changes that were coming into Spain at the time under Franco. So you see close-ups of the paintings. If you go to one particular image and look at it, you will see such things as his story on a country doctor in the South in the 1950s, or a nurse midwife in rural America. These things all had a very singular impact on the way culture was seen. We also went out on the streets to find both irony and depiction of straightforwardness. This is Gordon Park's story of a street gang in New York in the 50s. Just to let you know that gangsterism isn't something that just occurred in your generation, but in others too. Studies on psychological work and the destruction of the family began in the 50s as well. And of course, high art and entertainment flourished as well too. life had a very strong structure to it. And a man named Elliot Ellisoffen, who was a color photographer, in fact the color photographer for life, would travel around the world picturing different locales, different cultures, different foods and what have you. He went to Spain and to document Spain one year and did a picture on what was the Gold Coast of Spain at the time. And he came back with this nice picture of the boats and everything and decided to run it for the magazine. He toned it gold to match with the Gold Coast. Well, unfortunately, the original picture was in blues. And since he toned it in gold, and then he told his editors after a couple of million issues of Life had been printed and sold on the stand, it upset the editorial board of the magazine. No told that in 1955 somebody had actually manipulated a photograph and put it in Life, that it wasn't true to life somehow. So this picture got him in trouble. This serene, pictorial, calm image got him in trouble because it wasn't true. That was the standard in magazine publication at the time. It was on its way to change in the next decade, but that was the way it was. The commercial camera, well, it continued in those traditional directions you've seen before. It also incorporated more of what was going on in the arts, too, at the time. When you walked into a photographer's studio, he had a whole team behind him that was working. And you would see in the work things that came into the work, not just from the world of theater and design and sets, but also from such things as, well, Dali was going strong with surrealism, and other aspects of abstract expressionism were beginning to appear. Portraiture was also leaving the studio. One of the great practitioners in the 1950s and 60s of what became environmental portraiture was Arnold Newman. And we'll be having a show of Newman next spring here, by the way, since we have his archive. But this is his picture of David Ben-Gurion founding the State of Israel in 1948. And what he would do is pursue the subjects to where they lived, to where they worked, and take them in the environment in which they survived, so that he would give a better and more complete portrait of the subject, if you will. Color also began to flourish in very bold and dramatic ways at this time. You see it on the cover of magazines, you see it in photo spreads, and you see it even when you see the black and white images, how things began to be more abstract and more dramatic in the work. Fashion design went both inside the studio and now on location. It was very typical to go out, not just take a picture in the studio, but indeed to go out into the field with a makeup artist, with a hairstylist, with a promotional person, with 5 models, with the whole team of dress designers and dressers for the work, and shoot pictures, in that case in the Virgin Islands, in this case in Paris, that were going into the magazines at the time. This is a Smirnoff vodka ad photographed at the pyramids of Egypt.
It's a long ad.
The travel and documentary work also survived in very great numbers. Fritz Henley actually went out to the Hawaiian Islands to photograph the net casters, and after photographing it from the day from the side of the beach, he decided to go step out in the surf and have them throw the net at him. He created one of the great cliches of travel photography with this image, and you can still see this in any brochure to any sort of travel agency to this day, a photographer getting hit in the face with a net. But it's a much more dramatic and appealing picture. This is his picture of oil exploration in the Gulf, by the way, too. Well, in art, the usual trends were continuing, but they were beginning to be expanded, too. So realism was still with us. There was a greater diversity. Some people have focused on industrialization, some on urbanization. Others wanted to go in and find the human condition, strip it down to its soul. The rise of such groups as the Ashcan School and the 14th Street School wanted to really find this grimness of life. And of course the Federal Artist Project from before the war was one that was built upon and expanded by its artists as they evolved into society at the time. One of the great key movements was abstract expressionism, which also devolved at this era, grew out of the naturalist abstractions and the European expressionism of the time. It began to reflect those commercial and economic areas, and with the rise of art becoming a collectible commodity in the 50s and 60s, it also was one which could also support artists in a much better way. It also, of course, began to reflect the nervousness of the time, the sociological implications that were going on as well. So from the beginning of the century, you had rather serene abstractionism by people like Arthur Dove, or of course George O'Keeffe, who magnified upon what you saw and produced it in very calming colors. Piet Mondrian picked up some of the uniformity, some of the abstract patterns, and also some of the, I think, underlying nervousness of the era too, with his more formal, rigid structures. So that by the time we get to others, it becomes more pure in terms of form, until finally Jackson Pollock in the 1950s begins to really enjoy this whole thing with this famous group of drip paintings that really try and, shall we say, keep you on your feet and on your toes. Personal expression continues to be a key to the work as well. It again was derived from its predecessors, but it increasingly begins to evade the field of art. And even more so in terms of the art education. This is the era in which there are the first attempts to define a whole degree where you can go to college, get a degree in art, and then go out and make a living in it as a member of this group. Some of it is a bit more formal, more pictorial, most of it direct. But you can also begin to see things like mood take place as well. Roy de Carava, one of the great black photographers, photographed jazz. Not in the case of like the Louis Armstrong picture where you show you what the jazz artist looked like, but rather to try and express the mood that was there at the time. This is the one where I was talking about. We really need a soundtrack in here with some jazz going while we do this. But that's very much what happens. The invention of the electronic strobe managed to stop light down to a 10,000th of a second or even faster. But everything from the flight of a dove to the explosion of an atomic bomb was frozen. Portraiture became less about flattering a person than it was becoming a direct image of the relationship of the person. This is one of Harry Callahan's portrait series of his wife. Or you began to find more abstract patterns even in nature. Frederick Sommer, who of course you might have been influenced by Arp and some of the other surrealists, and you would be right, did his famous series of abstractions of chicken hearts. Jerry Yulsman began to print and manipulate images in the darkroom using things like solarization and multiple printings. This, by the way, is entitled The Woods Where I Met Myself. And others would even find other more abstract techniques to employ. When you see Jackson Pollock's drip painting, you might think of Henry Holmes Smith, who actually simply took a color sheet of film, dripped chemicals on it, and then processed it to create his abstractions. At this time also, because we had a whole war we came away from, we became aware, I think, much more solidly of what was going on in the world, certainly politically, certainly economically, but indeed even emotionally and artistically too. You began to see a greater evidence of rising photography in other areas of the globe, from Russia, for example, from France and the continent, from Poland, and from Germany. You find abstract expressionism employed, of course, but you also find other developments too as you go with the work too. But the print, like in this country, is beginning to be strongly manipulated. Or the everyday is beginning to be celebrated either either with studio composing of still lifes, or indeed just day-to-day snapshots. Well, this is a famous portrait photographer who decided to do his self-portrait because he was influenced by Picasso. Can you see it? Good, okay. All right. At any rate, two events occurred in the 50s which really emphasized this point. One was the World Exhibition of Photography in Lucerne in 1952. A commercial undertaking with many sponsors that occurred during the summer of that year. As you can see, it had 16 divisions and showed some 2,500 photographs throughout the buildings and edifices and even the streets of Lucerne. It was international in terms of its scope and themes. It gave equal representation to art and photojournalism, and it gave equal representation to history and to contemporary work. It was a thoroughly exhaustive exhibit. It made headlines around the world, and it failed completely. But it was a noble experiment. It was a key and critical development in the world. Perhaps the one that did succeed the most was The Family of Man. Sponsored by the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1955. Again, Edward Steichen, our friend from the pictorialist days, our friend from the World War II days, was now head of photography at MoMA. And he decided to do a show that was going to, quote, celebrate the essential goodness of man based on the human consciousness rather than a social consciousness. An important distinction at the time. He used photojournalistic work from existing photographers, documentary traditions that had occurred in different places, and picked some 273 photographers from 68 nations and their works to try and put them together in a show that was had over 500 images. It also was not hung in that's by the way what the book looks like. You can still find it. It came out in several different editions. He decided to do the show not with the traditional single frame of images on the wall. He made large prints, he made small prints. He hung them in overlapping panels such as you see here. You actually stepped into the show and walked throughout it. The beginning, when you first walked in the Museum of Modern Art, the entrance was a big camera with a lens and a projection on the thing. And you actually walked through the camera to go into the exhibition. So the entire presentation was meant to overwhelm you too, as well as the ideas that were there. At the time, it was very greatly celebrated. It was an extremely popular image. There were traveling shows created from it, and it circulated for a number of years. Now it is more critically observed in our more cynical age as something that was less than optimistic, that it was something that tried to homogenize the human race and to try and show that everybody was the same was not the purpose, that we should celebrate all cultures, which Steichen intentionally did not attempt to do. He was looking for the universality of man. So it is a much more debated entity now than it was in 1955. But it's important, I think, to note what a success it was in 1955 and how it reflected both its own age and the age at which photography existed at that time. I think perhaps the key to that is to looking at Steichen himself. You remember him, he who took the picture of J.P. Morgan with the chair that looked like the butcher knife, and who also practiced abstract expressionism with photography in its simplest and most mundane settings, this one of laughing boxes found on a fire escape in the 20s, who did a lot of commercial portraiture and commercial work for magazines in the 30s and 40s, who styled himself first as a painter before he discovered photography, and who ended up, of course, leading the whole military-industrial unit of photography for the U.S. Navy in World War II. The man who stands in stark juxtaposition to this is a fellow named Robert Frank. Frank was Swiss in origin, came to this country in the 50s, was very much a loner, was one of the first people to be funded by a private foundation. And his foundation grant was to travel America and document America as I see it. In 1958, he published a book called The Americans. It was so, at the time it was so thought of as being a cynical and harsh picture of America that the first publisher was a French publisher, not an American publisher. It did not get published in this country until the following year. It was immediately embraced by people like the Beats, people like the cultural intellectuals, who saw it as a, well, what did the Beats do? They were contrary to the establishment of the time. So it was a counter-establishment sort of work. And at the time, it was not well received because its picture was one of a very harsh, very undemocratic, very unfavorable America, which for the mid to late 1950s was really a statement. Kerouac, in fact, did the introduction for the book. But to him, life was this sort of lonely, symbolic highway. And every picture in the book was also symbolic. The lonely elevator girl taking people into the exotic party. These sort of things appealed to that sort of negative portrait of America. The interesting thing about the Americans is that at the time it was harshly received. A new car that looks like a draped body. At the time it was harshly received, but within a decade, with the rise and change in the 60s that's coming along, it was completely reversed. This work became a monumental work. It became influential for the entire generation of photographers that came along in the 60s and 70s and 80s. This sort of alienation was not only reflected in a different light, but indeed embraced. And Frank is the one who stands in that juxtaposition. So we find ourselves at the end of the 50s in this very interesting little world of transition that's coming along. And we're going to see just exactly where that leads in the latter part of the 20th century next time. But always remember where Steichen was and where Frank is, because they stand sort of at opposite poles right in this era. And they're both very important from the positions they take. Cinema at the time. Well, everything is affected by World War II, by the atomic age, by the Cold War, by the rise of science. That these things begin to be reflected in the cinema that comes out of World War II and the following two. These are the final heydays of black and white. The world is starting to shift to color now in this era. And also we're seeing a very, very big rise in international markets. Filmmaking had always been huge. You've seen some examples in some of the others I've given you of especially work that was done in Germany before the war. But now it becomes to be spread universally. It's leading to the fact that foreign films are not only being made, but they're being bought by the commercial markets in this country and in Europe and shown on the A list, not just the B list. And these modern cultural themes of existentialism, where have we heard that before? Abstraction, paranoia, psychological film, phenomenology are all starting to appear in the language of the filmmaker and in the work that's evolving at this time. Some examples to show you in a moment, just to give some pictures of what was there. You begin to see, although U.S. predominates here, that the foreign films are also becoming to rise more in this era too. Of course, the capturing film, and probably the one that's always voted the greatest, Orson Welles' Citizen Kane, which was really something that was a combination of telling of pictures not in any sort of structural, thematic way, but ones that had a mystery, one that could go back and forth in time, one that could exist both in flashback and contemporary narrative. And also it was photographed in a very dramatic way, with great depth of field, great power, some of the best cinematography of its era. And it really changed the way that filmmaking was going to be embraced for the next decades to come. Romanticism, pictorialism still exists and still tug at the heartstrings. Casablanca, of course, being the strong demonstration of that work. Done in the middle of the war, finding the romance and love in the middle of the devastation of war was a message that was clear and evident from the time. Probably the best interesting image of what it was like to come through a war, though, came right after the war with The Best Years of Our Lives, William Wyler's film. Because Wyler wanted to show what it was like to come back from war, to come back from something that actually came along and interrupted the everyday person's life, who was thrown into a war and then came back to a culture and society that was changing, that would never be the same, that was transported in some way. And that particular picture of transformation of culture and society is one of the strongest ones that exists. It's a Wonderful Life came along too. This is the Christmas season coming up, so you'll be seeing it a lot on television. It was an interesting show because it had to do very much not just with the change of culture that was going on at the time, but also personal change. It had to do not only with an optimism, but also with a fatalism too. It had an ugly side to it. And yet it, at the same time, offered hope and redemption at the end. It was a struggle of sort of every man in the common time and what would happen and what would be reflected through that imagery. The narrative is something that's very strong in this picture, and it really gives it a certain power that I think makes it a continual perennial favorite. not just because of its Christmas message, but because of its human message as well. The Bicycle Thief came from Vittorio De Sica in Italy. Really a simple story. A man is trying to make a living after the war by being a bicycle messenger, and somebody steals his bicycle. And he and his son go about through Italy and through all levels of culture and society, trying to find the bicycle and trying to find themselves at the time. It had to show, I think, a real harshness of the economic reality of what came along after World War II in Europe. But it also showed some depth of the human spirit that was capable of change, even in the face of what was lost after the war. In my book, one of the great films, The Third Man, which was filmed entirely in Vienna right after World War II, showed the city being rebuilt, recast, showed the optimistic side of one person coming into it from America who was trying to find an old friend in Europe, to try and find out what was going on at the time and trying to reshape his own life. Orson Welles, of course, always gets all the great scenes in this show, but I think more than that, it was sort of a picture of a place and a time, because it wanted to show what life was like at the end of the war and how depressing this could be and what a challenge it could be to try and come to terms with life and this particular era and place and time. Above all, I think it's about change. Change that comes to every generation and every place, and when it's been knocked about by a war, even more so. Because things that suddenly appear to be heroic or of one sort become something totally different in the whole picture of this image. It also has one of the great entrances of anybody into a film, but I won't spoil that for you. Cinema in the 50s even began to tackle these themes some more, again becoming more universal at the time and more uncertain about what was going on with the world at this particular era. Rashomon, which is a Japanese image by Akira Kurosawa, very fascinating picture, ostensibly simply about the rape of a woman, but actually more complex every detail because it's told from 4 different narrations, 4 different points of view. And your alliances and your feelings about both the victim and the people involved in the crime changes with each narration. And you try and uncover the levels of a truth that may not be there. It may be hidden for all time, and anybody who tries to figure it out may be subject to knowing that there is no truth out there in the world after all. Howard Hawks' The Thing, which has sort of been looked upon as one of the early pictures about the paranoia of the world, the modern era, but finally the UFO, which is coming into place in time in our own culture, and the absolute mystery of what's going on with science fiction, and more so with how we can, what our limitations are as a human species to fight the future. The Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the great paranoid movie of all time. You will learn not to trust anybody, your friends, or your love at the end of this picture. But at the same time, I think that is really a special film because it does capture that thing. It makes you feel itchy, it makes you feel twitchy, it makes you feel unsure of yourself and everyone else around you. Ingmar Bergsman's The Seventh Seal, which I still need a great interpreter for every time I see it, because it is on one level symbolic, on another level mystical, on another level fatalistic. Simple story of a knight trying to face the question of death, but as typical with all Bergman films, laying itself with great issues. Here you go. Here, read the caption for one particular image for it, and you can see. It's entirely in Swedish. It has some of the best imagery you will ever see in a motion picture. It's black and white, and still manages to taunt you and tape you with the same feeling. The cynicism that was abroad in America is best summarized by The Sweet Smell of Success, Alexander McKendrick's motion picture from the time. Ostensibly simply about a power-hungry columnist modeled after Walter Winchell, but to show the rise to which American culture will go to try and make itself successful in the post-war era. And of course, the paranoid film of all time, Psycho, which I think is probably not only extremely terrifying the first time you see it, but also something that continues to add a puzzle and level of how do we represent ourselves and how do we see ourselves in others. All these films sort of capture that emotion, capture that period. And at the end of all of them, you became more unsure of where you are and what you were doing. And that's what's going to lead into this final era. I see I'm talking to you again Monday about the rest of the era. So we're going to try and cover 3 to 4 decades real quickly in an hour and show you what happens in all this time period. But above all else, please remember that what is reflected by the things that Dan is showing you is coming to pass in the arts as well.